Hello? Oh, what time is it, man? Yeah, just... Sorry, I was miles away, just please don't spoil my day. Yeah. Right, okay. I'm only sleeping, man. Okay. See you soon. Oh, I've got time. Ceiling, man, it's just all colour and wonder. It's far out. Hello? Yes, I heard, yeah. I'll be up soon, yeah, I'm not doing any harm, am I? Okay, right, I'll see you in an hour then, okay. Yes. I'm still in bed, yes I am, okay? Well, I'm just keeping an eye basically on the world going by my window. You just notice all these people, man, they're running at such a speed. What's the need in that? Why are they still moving so quick? I don't really care if you think I'm lazy, I think you're crazy, man. You're downstairs. Right, okay, I'll come up. Down even, yeah. Sorry, I'm half asleep. Okay. Bloody pest. Why can't I just stay lying here staring at the ceiling, man? Welcome back to Revolver In-Depth. This is episode 3. I'm only sleeping. Right then folks, it's time to get psychedelic here for the first time on this series because we're looking at the first John Lennon song on Revolver, and by this point in his life Mr. Lennon was feeling pretty psychedelic, probably largely due to some of the substances he was taking at this point in his life. Anyway, since the Beatles had gotten famous in 1963, they'd had virtually no free time. Their life had been one hectic mess. They were either constantly on tour all around the world. If they weren't doing that, they'd be in the recording studio making albums and singles, and if they weren't doing that, they'd probably be on a film set recording a feature-length film. If they weren't doing that, they were probably being interviewed for some TV show or for some magazine or something. Basically, their life wasn't their own, and 1966 was looking to be exactly the same as that, and the year was supposed to start the first 3 months with them recording their third feature-length film for United Artists. So their third film was supposed to be named A Talent for Loving, written by producer Walter Shenson, and this was supposed to be based off a Western novel by Richard Condon. Now the band had set aside the first few months of 1966 to record this film, but in December 1965, the Beatles read the script and they didn't like it, they hated it, so they rejected it and refused to do it. So that meant now there was no film to make at the start of 1966. So for the first time since the band had gotten famous, they virtually had 3 months of nothing on, so they had a lot of free time on their hands. So with all this extra time off at the start of 1966, Lennon would pretty much spend this entire time just at his home in Weybridge. And there he would either spend the time sleeping, watching TV, reading books or writing. Most of the time when he was doing all this stuff, it was under the influence of drugs. Now the only time he would really get out of bed or be woken up would be when Paul McCartney would show up. Now Paul would often show up late in the day or in the afternoon, so about 2:30, 3 o'clock. And when he got there, John was still asleep in bed. So Paul would often be the one to wake Lennon up that day. So, yeah, Lennon was being a pretty lazy bugger at this point in his life. As part of Lennon's How a Beatle Lives interview with his friend Maureen Cleave for the Evening Standard in March 1966, Cleave said the following of Lennon: "He can sleep almost indefinitely, is probably the laziest person in England. Physically lazy," he said. "I don't mind writing or reading or watching or speaking, but sex is the only physical thing I can be bothered with anymore." Now looking back at this now from a modern perspective, it sounds like Lennon was pretty depressed at this point. In fact, he wasn't getting out of bed, he couldn't be bothered doing anything. I mean, he'd literally not long before this written a song called Help. It was a cry for help. So yeah, Lennon was being very lazy, and of course that was also the famous interview where he famously said the band were more popular than Jesus. Bet he lived to regret that, eh? Now at some point in early 1966, on the back of a letter of all things, Lennon would start writing a song about his love for staying in bed, his love for being lazy, and about how McCartney would keep coming into his house and waking Lennon up from this dreamlike wonder he was in. Now, these initial drafts of the lyrics, they were all pretty simple stuff. It was just simply about being in bed and enjoying it. But as time went on, as was often the case with John's songs around this period, drug references would start seeping its way into his lyrics, and that's no different here. There's a few acid references in here, shall we say. So the Beatles would begin recording I'm Only Sleeping at Abbey Road Studios, or EMI Studios as it was known then, on April 27th of 1966. Now for this session, the band actually worked in Studio 3 rather than the traditional Studio 2 that they worked in. Now this session would be focusing on getting the basic track laid down for I'm Only Sleeping. They would record 11 takes of the basic track this day, and they would deem take 11 as the best, and that would be the one that would be used as the basis for adding overdubs to, and the finished version of the song that's on the album, that is take 11. For this session, Lennon played Gibson jumbo acoustic guitar, McCartney played his Rickenbacker bass, and Starr played drums. Harrison wouldn't play on the basic track for I'm Only Sleeping. The band performed the track in E minor, but the tape machine was running at a faster speed than normal, so the recording would actually sound slower and a semitone lower on playback, which created an effect that Lennon liked. So the next session for I'm Only Sleeping would take place 2 days later on April 29th of 1966, and since nailing the basic track on April 27th, Lennon in the subsequent days had started to have doubts about it. He felt that the band could do it better. So to begin with here, most of this session would be spent working on remakes of the basic track. To begin with, during this session, the band recorded a number of rehearsals featuring drums, acoustic guitars and a vibraphone. Now this is the first time the Beatles ever used a vibraphone. It was only ever used on the rehearsals for I'm Only Sleeping. It wasn't used on any of the actual takes, so I'm not too sure why they used it in this rehearsal. But they were just basically experimenting with new instruments. They'd never used this one before, and I imagine they just wanted to hear what it sounded like. Anyway, as is often the case with Beatles rehearsals, they were recorded onto tape, the Beatles would listen back to them, and then when they came to do the actual takes, they would then record over the rehearsals, and that's what's happened here. But the actual takes haven't gone on long enough, so some of the rehearsals have survived. And one of these rehearsals has been released. It was released on 1996's Anthology 2, and then again on the 2022 Super Deluxe edition of Revolver. It's quite nice actually. It's only about 50 seconds long, but it's very dreamy. It's worth a listen. Now when it came to doing the actual takes of this remake, the band would actually only record 5 takes, and only one of them was a complete take, take 1. And take 1 has subsequently been released. You can hear it on 1996's Anthology 2. And I've got to say, of all the outtakes, this is one of my favourites. I really like this take. It's kind of an indie rock sounding version of the song. It's just some acoustic guitars, some percussion and vocals from Lennon and McCartney. It's really, really nice. It's really stripped down, it's really bare, and it's cool. Yeah, I really like it. It's by far the most interesting outtake of I'm Only Sleeping. Now, if the rehearsal and take 1 is not enough outtakes for you, well, good news. Even more of them have now been released on 2022 Super Deluxe edition of Revolver. You can find take 2 and take 5 on there. Now, I'm not 100% sure if take 2 and take 5 here is from the second day of sessions or the original first day of sessions. What doesn't help here is they didn't call the second day of sessions take 12 to 16. They went with 1 to 5 again, because I imagine they thought, well, we're doing a remake here, so the previous day's work, that can all be disregarded, and this will be us starting afresh. Obviously, that didn't happen. We'll get onto that in a sec. But the reason why I think these are probably from the second day of sessions is the way that Giles Martin structures these Super Deluxe editions, these box sets, is he puts all the outtakes in chronological order, in the order they were recorded by day. And he's put the rehearsal fragment before take 2 and take 5. Now, if it was take 2 and take 5 from the first day of sessions, they would come before the rehearsal fragment. So the fact they come after it on the box set makes me think these outtakes, are from the second day of sessions. Now anyway, in terms of what these outtakes are, take 2 is much more bassy, it's much more slower, but it breaks down halfway through, and then they sort of start it again. So I don't know, even though it just says take 2 on the release, if this is both take 2 and take 3. It probably is, to be honest. And then take 5 is quite an interesting one. This one's just an instrumental, but it's played very, very fast. To be honest, it sounds a bit like a western. If I had my way and I was ever making a western, I would put this song in the soundtrack for a western film I'd be making, because it sounds really good, like galloping on a horse through the deserts of Arizona or somewhere like that. Now, at some point during this day's session, the Beatles would obviously realise that these remakes were not going the way they were hoping that they would, so instead they would revert back to working on take 11 from the previous session. So with attention now turned back to take 11, Lennon would now overdub his lead vocals onto the track. Once again, the tape machine was running slightly slower than normal, so when they listened back to it at normal speed, Lennon's voice sounded higher and faster, an effect that he liked and wanted left on the song. So the next session for I'm Only Sleeping would take place on May 5th of 1966, once again in Studio 3 rather than the band's traditional home of Studio 2. Now this day's session could be argued to be the most significant of them all because this was the day where Harrison recorded his guitar parts. Now what makes the guitar parts special on this song is they're all played backwards. Backwards guitar here used for the first time ever on a record. No one had ever recorded backwards guitar before. This is the first time ever on I'm Only Sleeping that anyone ever did it. So here we have the Beatles pioneering sounds. So in order to achieve this backwards guitar sound, Harrison had to work very carefully alongside George Martin. So what the pair did was they had to feed the tape into the machine backwards. Then Harrison would record his guitar parts as normal, so forward if you will. Then once he'd done that, they'd have to take the tape off, flip it over and listen back to it so that they could hear what it sounds like backwards. Now this involved a hell of a lot of trial and error, and a lot of stuff would be recorded that just couldn't be used because it was no good. And George apparently spent 5 hours, I think, 5-6 hours just recording different guitar parts to try and get a sound, this dreamlike sound he was trying to achieve. Now in the end, Harrison would successfully record 5 different backwards guitar parts that were intended for the song. However, at no point have all 5 of these ever been used in any mixes of the song. Basically, I'm Only Sleeping, long story short, I'll get to it later in the video. There are different mixes, there's I think 4 different mixes that exist to this song. The UK mono mix is basically the main one, that's the standard one, that's the one the Beatles and George Martin created. And that's the one that features the most backwards guitar in it, but it only features I think 3 or 4 of these backward guitar parts. So yeah, all of them haven't been heard, so they're still unheard. George Harrison backwards guitar solos kicking about somewhere. Now I can't play it in this video because the Beatles stuff is heavily copyrighted and protected and stuff, and I don't want to risk getting this copyright striked. But if you go online, you can hear the I'm Only Sleeping solo played forwards, which is really weird because it's the actual song played backwards, but you've been playing the song backwards because it's got backwards guitar on, it therefore makes the guitar go forwards. So if you play it like that and you listen to it online, you'll actually hear the way Harrison recorded the solo in the studio. It's quite interesting. Anyway, by the end of this day's session, Harrison had successfully recorded all the backwards guitar parts that he needed, and in doing so, he'd kind of pioneered a new sound, a new type of music that had never been done before. So the final session for I'm Only Sleeping would take place on May 6th of 1966, with the band now working again in their traditional home of Studio 2. So first up in this session, Lennon would double track his lead vocals he'd recorded on April 29th, whilst McCartney and Harrison simultaneously recorded harmonies for the track. Now the last thing that the band recorded for the song was a yawn by McCartney. Now you can hear this just before the second bridge, depending on the mix you listen to. Now you can definitely hear this on the original UK mono mix. This of course was the mix created by the Beatles and George Martin. But the original UK stereo mix, the Beatles and George Martin never had anything to do with the stereo mixes because at the time mono was what everyone listened to. Stereo was just owned. Stereo record players were only owned by people with a lot of money, so not many people bought stereo records in the UK. So therefore the Beatles and George Martin, they didn't really pay much attention to the stereo mixes. They weren't really forward thinking about it. The only thing that they ever did where they weren't forward thinking enough to think that perhaps in time it will get more cheaper and everyone will move to stereo. But anyway, basically the stereo mixes were created by junior engineers, I think, at Abbey Road. So for some reason, with I'm Only Sleeping, they removed the yawn just before the second bridge. Now when the Beatles catalogue was standardised for CD in the 1980s, the UK stereo mixes became the standard mixes worldwide. And because of that, the yawn was lost to time. It was just, you couldn't hear it unless you had an original mono mix of the album. But thankfully, in 2022, when Giles Martin did his remix of the album, stereo remix for the Super Deluxe edition of Revolver, he restored the yawn back to its rightful place. So for the first time ever on a stereo mix, you could hear the yawn. So once again, as I said in my Taxman video, I do not understand for the life of me why any person, any sane human being, would listen to the original stereo mixes of Revolver. If you want to know what they are and you can't tell which is which, basically if you're on streaming services and it says remastered 2009, that's the original stereo mix. Don't bother with that, it's terrible. Listen to the Super Deluxe edition of Revolver where you have 2 options on that. You can go with the 2022 remix or you can go with the original mono mix on both of them. So why you wouldn't pick one of them, I don't know. Anyway, the Beatles and George Martin would mix the song in mono on June 6th for 1966, and with that, the song was complete and ready to go. So Revolver was released on August 5th of 1966, and I'm Only Sleeping will be sequenced as the 3rd track on the album, John Lennon's first song on the album. Now, as I mentioned, there are 4 different mixes of this song. There's the original UK mono mix, which is the one the Beatles and George Martin created, so if you're going to listen, arguably that's the one to go with, because that's what they intended. There's the UK stereo mix, which was created by junior engineers at Abbey Road. And there's also the US stereo and US mono mixes, which were created by Capitol Records, which the Beatles again had nothing to do with. But you can't really find those anymore. I think you can only get them if you buy original US copies of the albums. But there is also, of course, now as well, as I mentioned, the Giles Martin remix. So basically, if you want to listen to this song and Revolver as a whole, either the original UK mono mix or the 2022 Giles Martin remix, take your pick, whichever one takes your fancy, really. Anyway, I'm Only Sleeping received a lot of praise when it came out from critics and fellow musicians at the time for its pioneering backwards guitar sounds. Right then, so this probably won't come as a surprise to any of you, but I absolutely love this song. This era of John Lennon is my favourite John Lennon era, this psychedelic era. I just think it's him at his creative peak, it's him at his best. Kind of everything after Sgt. Pepper, it wasn't quite as creatively exciting, I think, as what this era of Lennon was, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper. So of all of John Lennon's career, I think the psychedelic period is his toppermost of his poppermost. The song itself is basically about being a lazy bugger. It's got some brilliant lyrics in it. Please don't spoil my day, I'm miles away. Everybody seems to think I'm lazy. I don't mind, I think they're crazy. I just think this is some of John Lennon's best lyrics. They're quite relatable, I imagine, for a lot of people, this song. I mean, it's not really... Yeah, there's maybe the odd drug reference in this song, but for the most part, it's pretty run-of-the-mill kind of understandable lyrics. This is just about enjoying being in bed and dreaming. I mean, everybody has dreams, don't they? We all dream, man. It's far out. Anyway, I can't talk about I'm Only Sleeping and not mention Harrison's backwards guitar stuff. George's backwards guitar on here, it makes the record, arguably. It makes it the interesting song it is. It takes it into the psychedelic realm that it was aiming for. It gives it this dreamlike wonder that they were aiming for. This song is really one of the band's first forays into the psychedelic arena. Up until this point, they hadn't done that many psychedelic songs, if any. It's the first one you hear on Revolver anyway. I can't remember. There's maybe a couple later on the album that were recorded before this one. But it's the first one for a lot of people that I heard, because it's obviously the first psychedelic song on the album. And it's a pretty big departure from what John Lennon had been doing up until this point. I mean, on the previous album, Rubber Soul, John had been writing quite a few folk songs, stuff like Norwegian Wood, Girl, things like that. And now suddenly, it's kind of a little still folky with its acoustic guitar, but it's now more psychedelic because of the backwards guitar and the slowed down, sped up vocal effect. Now, something I didn't really properly pay attention to until I've been doing this series is the way that Revolver is structured. So far we're 3 tracks in, and each track has progressively got more experimental. Now, this wouldn't carry on through the whole album. Some of them wouldn't be as experimental as others still to come. But, and I don't know if this is an intentional thing, but Taxman starts off as a pretty standard rock and roll song. Then suddenly we go down this sort of striking, jarring string section in the form of Eleanor Rigby with no guitars on it whatsoever. And now we're plummeted into this psychedelic soundscape of John Lennon. And the next track as well is also very experimental, but we'll get to that in the next episode. So yeah, Revolver, the way it's structured, especially its first few tracks, is very, I think, deliberate to test listeners. Because I imagine a lot of people listening to this will be thinking, what the hell is this? Where is this album going? Yeah, it's brilliant. I love it. Now, at the time when this album came out, there was nothing like it. Nothing like this had ever been done. It must have been completely mind-blowing to people listening to it for the first time. And arguably to this day, it still sounds somewhat like the future. I mean, this at the time, to a lot of people listening to it, what I'm trying to say here, is people that listen to this album think, oh, that sounds like the future. But it didn't ever really come to sound like this. And you could listen to it to this day. I still listen to it sometimes and think, oh, this album, it sounds like the future. And I'm Only Sleeping is one of the songs, particularly because of its backwards guitar, that makes it sound like, oh, we're going into the future here. Not so much this song as one that comes later on in the album, the closing track, we'll get to that one though. Which really does still sound like the future. Anyway, I'm rambling on here, so to conclude, I'm Only Sleeping. It is one of John Lennon's best tracks. John has some great songs on Revolver, and this is the first of many. Like I say, psychedelic Lennon is my favourite era of Lennon, and yeah, this is just a song about being a lazy person, and it's a really good song. I really like it. So that concludes another episode of Revolver In-Depth, folks. Once again, thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this, please do like the video, leave a comment, let me know what you think of I'm Only Sleeping. Please do subscribe to this channel if you're not already subscribed. It would greatly mean the world to me. If you've enjoyed this and you want to see the previous episodes in the series, well, good news, there is a playlist on my channel called Revolver In-Depth, which includes all previous episodes, and all future episodes will also be put in there. Anyway, join me next time here on Revolver In-Depth, where you won't get time to hang a sign on me. Till then though, do take care.